Hi, this time I want to talk about Megadungeons. So, what is a Megadungeon in role playing games? In tabletop role playing games specifically, because there are Megadungeons in video games as well. When it comes to a tabletop role playing game, Megadungeon, in its simplest definition, it's just a dungeon that is immense, much larger, of greater scope when compared to your standard dungeon crawl situation. They feel a lot like mini campaign settings within a campaign setting, or perhaps a campaign setting by themselves. Some of them are just too huge. They could be considered another area entirely apart from the game world that you can explore using your system of preference. Many of the things that I mentioned in my videos where I talk about campaign settings, and I'm going to put the playlist in the description below to those videos, apply to a Mega Dungeon. But the Mega Dungeon does have several unique things to it. First, let's begin talking about some barriers of entry when it comes to Mega Dungeons. The first and the most obvious barrier of entry is that some Mega Dungeons can be quite expensive. Normally, they are between $30 to $50 when it comes to the PDF version. When it's a physical product, it's going to be more than that. But there are some Mega Dungeons that even in PDF format, they cost about $100. So we have to consider why that happens to justify or perhaps to reject the offer that is being given to us when a Mega Dungeon is presented, when you find it in RPG or any other store. So I think when it comes to the range between $30 to $50, it is actually worth it in most decent or well-constructed Mega Dungeons, because a Mega Dungeon is going to offer many years of entertainment depending on how you play it, how you run it. Not only the main campaign featured in the Mega Dungeon could take a couple of years to finish, it's also a source for adventure seeds, and it offers many ideas on how to further develop or expand the encounters and situations contained in the Mega Dungeon. So when you are purchasing a Mega Dungeon, you are purchasing about 2 years, unless you are very hardcore and you play several times a week. It usually takes about 2 years to finish a Mega Dungeon. But in other cases, when it comes to Mega Dungeons that are they charge you $100 for them, I actually don't feel too encouraged to get those Mega Dungeons, because it's not that perhaps the Mega Dungeon is worth it, but you're not always sure if you will be able to get the bang for your buck, the value for that product, because it disconnects with the other barrier of entry. But just to mention it briefly, a Mega Dungeon takes such a long time to finish, and you don't know if you will be able to see things through to the very end. We will talk more about that in a few minutes, but just to give some sort of wrap up to the price situation, I think it's perfectly reasonable that Mega Dungeons are offered at between $30 and $50. Some Mega Dungeons try to make this a bit more easy to digest or easy on the wallet when they present they sell different elements or parts of the Mega Dungeon separately. So some things could be optional. For example, one of the coolest parts of a Mega Dungeon, in my opinion, more than anything because it has its roots in the first editions of Dungeons and Dragons, is that you have these handouts, these images to show to your players so that they better visualize or imagine the situation that the character is going through. You have these illustrations of passageways and rooms and strange devices, and sometimes they sell that booklet separately because you can purchase the other part of the Mega Dungeon without using those images, because as long as the description of a particular room, corridor, hallway, etc. is handled correctly. So some Mega Dungeons do offer that option to purchase them a bit so that it's a bit more affordable or cheaper. Not that the dungeon is a cheap Mega Dungeon, but that it's a bit easier on the wallet, like I said. So now let's move on to the second barrier of entry, commitment. When you play a Mega Dungeon, in most cases, maybe you will only get to experience like 40 or 50% of the Mega Dungeon unless you have a group that dedicates itself to finishing the Mega Dungeon. You could also handle it in other ways. You could run the Mega Dungeon, and as people are dropping from the campaign, you can accept other players even though the campaign is ongoing. You will only need to get them up to speed, give them characters of the appropriate level if you're handling things like that, and the Mega Dungeon moves on. It continues despite those players dropping out. But like I said, I think running and playing Mega Dungeons is somewhat of a exceptional case when compared to other shorter campaigns. Throughout my life, I've only heard of a few people that have finished an entire Mega Dungeon, and you have to take their word for it. I don't doubt that, or that I do not. I believe that there are plenty of people that have finished Mega Dungeons, but I think they are a minority when compared to the rest of the role players and game masters. In most cases, including myself, I have never finished the Mega Dungeon. I only, at most, I reached, like I said, like perhaps a 40% of the Mega Dungeon. Sometimes people cannot commit to such a long-term campaign. And so you have to think if that is, if you're getting, like I said, value for your money when you purchase those expensive Mega Dungeons. Perhaps you are happy with just running or experiencing 40 or 50% of the Mega Dungeon. You could also look at Mega Dungeons as if they are like toolkits, and you can cut different rooms and pieces and hazards and treasures and use them in other adventures. That's another way to look at things. But when it comes to a group that decides to take on the Mega Dungeon, they have my respect when it comes to their commitment. Imagine playing 2 or even more years of a single Mega Dungeon with the same group. In most cases, I think people are dropping out and getting into the game, but it's still quite the feat, quite the accomplishment. So looking at things like that, it all depends on how you're going to use that Mega Dungeon. So as long as you don't feel like the Mega Dungeon isn't worth it, I don't think you will have much trouble with the price, as long as there aren't other pressing matters when it comes to spending your money. I think it's money worth spending if you're going to be using your Mega Dungeon to run it as a single campaign, or to chop and take pieces from the Mega Dungeon and use them in different adventures and campaigns. And as long as you have a committed group, or at the very least you have complete confidence in that you will be able to replace players during the adventure, then it's also worth it. It's all up to you. So now let's take a closer look at what a Mega Dungeon contains and how it connects with the campaign setting. I think it is crucial that a Mega Dungeon feels quite unique. Some Mega Dungeons could feel a bit too generic for some people. But I think there is also an opportunity for you to take that generic mega dungeon, and because it is so vanilla, so almost like plain, mm, you can take any elements from the game world in which you are running the mega dungeon and apply them to the mega dungeon itself. Maybe the mega dungeon doesn't contain any specific deities. You can use deities from your setting. Maybe the mega dungeon is not exactly, it's not well defined if it's purely classic fantasy or it's more on the science fantasy side. You can also use elements from your own campaign setting and replace some traps. Maybe it's no longer a crossbow trap. Maybe now it's some sort of firearm connected to the wall. It could be handled in different ways. Different spell effects within the mega dungeon could now be more related to weird science. So a mega dungeon truly is a campaign setting on its own. At the time of this video, there's actually a bundle in the Bundle of Holding website. I'm going to put the link in the description below, where they are offering it is called the world's largest mega dungeon, or the world's largest dungeon. I'm not exactly sure if it's actually the largest dungeon, but it's a mega dungeon. Some people have criticized some things about it. I actually do not own it. Maybe by the end of the month, or who knows, maybe I will take advantage of that offer. But I have seen that mega dungeon throughout the years, and I read some reviews, and they always say things like the theme is not strong enough, it is too generic, or because it is based on Dungeons and Dragons. I don't remember if it's 3.0 or 3.5. The monsters are comparatively weak when you run it perhaps using Pathfinder or using some extra options and splat books for Dungeons and Dragons 3.0 or 3.5. But it also contains information how to scale encounters. So it's not that it's very difficult to run it. You just need to consider some things concerning difficulty and the flavor, how that story connects with the game world. So back to Mega Dungeons as campaign settings. It's much better if you manage to connect those Mega Dungeons to the greater campaign world, but the characters are going to be spending a lot of time inside that Mega Dungeon. So even though the Mega Dungeon itself could contain a very powerful, very unique or original theme going for it, I think it's always advisable to connect it in some way to any setting in which you are using it, in Forgotten Realms and Midgard, Kryn, Ravenloft, Mystara, etc. There are some really good mega dungeons out there. Like, for example, if you like new school style of fantasy roleplay, Eyes of the Stone Thief for 13th Age. If you like more old school mega dungeons, oh, you have plenty. You have Barrow Maze, Stonehill. I forget the name. I think it was Stonehill. Of course, Undermountain. The many products detailing Undermountain. There are also other mega dungeons from the creator of Barrow Maze. I haven't played those. You also have the Castle of the Mad Archmage for Adventures Dark and Deep. So there are plenty of options, all of them with different themes. Without spoiling things too much, and because they make it quite evident at the beginning and the start of the Mega Dungeon, in the case of Eyes of the Stone Thief, it's a living Mega Dungeon. It's a creature that is swallowing things, a construct of sorts, and that's how it has that ecosystem. Many creatures living within it, many structures, sites, because it has been literally swallowing places of the game world. In the case of Barrow Maze, it's a very creepy mega dungeon, and just not to avoid spoilers, it is related to some very nefarious necromantic powers. In the case of the dungeon of the Mad Archmage, I think it's a really cool thing because it gives an excuse for the typical funhouse mega dungeon where some things are just placed there, and it makes no sense that they are there just to challenge the player characters. But the excuse there is that there is a Mad Archmage that is having his fun by subjecting those who enter the mega dungeon to all sorts of deadly situations. Excuse me. So there are plenty of mega dungeons, but even though they have all of those themes going for them, you can take those themes and adapt them to the setting. So if you were to take the Mad Archmage, how does that Mad Archmage connect with the other mages in the setting? If you are running it in Greyhawk, is he a threat, or is he perhaps an old acquaintance of one of the more powerful mages, perhaps Mordenkainen? If it's in the Forgotten Realms, maybe that Archmage used to belong to an organization, maybe to the Harpers or to the Zentarim, to any of the good or bad organizations. How does he relate to other powerful mages like Elminster or Manchun? And so it's all about making those connections. Something really unique about Mega Dungeons is that a single Mega Dungeon contains so many factions within it. There are so many groups of people that throughout the years in the game world, for one reason or another, they have made their home, their cities, even their cities or towns inside the Mega Dungeon. And they are sometimes at odds with each other, or sometimes they are on friendly terms. And it's up to the group of adventurers if they want to exploit this relationship between the different factions. Perhaps the player characters handle things in a sort of I'm forgetting the name of this movie. It's a Wild West movie, A Fistful of Dollars, if I remember correctly, where Clint Eastwood is playing one of the faction against the one faction against the other faction. So maybe the player characters want to do that. They want to create some deceit, carry out some sort of deceitful tactics to put the blame on a certain faction so that that faction attacks the other faction, and then the other faction retaliates, and the player characters act like they are giving them information, or perhaps sometimes acting on the side of one faction as mercenaries, and then they go to the side of the other faction. Although that's a delicate game to play when it comes to the characters, the groups, trust with the factions. They may end up attacking the group of adventurers if they start to see that they are playing them against each other. Other times, the group of adventurers could feel connected, or they could empathize. Yeah, like come into an agreement or a certain settlement with a faction. Maybe they are reaching towards a goal that the characters are also trying to accomplish, or maybe they are looking for something that the characters want to obtain. They could split the earnings. In that context, the player characters become allies of that faction, and they work together. They could even become friends on the long term. And this is important because inside the Mega Dungeon, sometimes you cannot go out back into the surface world. Maybe it's not an underground dungeon. Maybe it's some other structure, like for example, in my review of, I forgot the name, it's a really cool horror campaign, and it's basically a mega dungeon. It's a haunted house. I'm going to put the link in the description below to my review of that. I can't believe I forgot the name. The Dread House. I'm going to put it in the description. Maybe, like I said, there are mega dungeons that are not exactly dungeons. They could be like these huge mansions. In the Grande Temple of Jing, that I also reviewed, I'm also going to put the link in the description below. in that case, it's not exactly underground either. There are some underground places, but there are so many levels and even connections to other dimensions. So regardless of the nature of the mega dungeon, sometimes you enter the mega dungeon and you cannot escape, or you go too deep into the mega dungeon, so it's more troublesome to go back to the entrance, avoiding different random encounters and dangerous situations with other members of other factions and monsters and creatures. It's very useful to have a place where you can rest and recover and purchase items, weapons, etc. And that is offered by the different factions. If you enter into friendly terms with a faction, then you have an adventure hub within the mega dungeon. There are some very dangerous. I don't. Maybe it could also be considered a mega dungeon, the City of the Spider Queen. That adventure takes a lot of time. It's basically going to take characters from I think it was from level 10 to level 18, and unless they have access to some sort of teleportation, sometimes you will have to carry out trading and commerce with creatures of the Underdark, perhaps by disguising yourself using polymorph or something, because those people that you're, or rather those beings that you're interacting with in the mega dungeon, oftentimes they are hostile. So you need to find a way to get into their good graces, or not to become too suspicious that you're actually in that place to do something against their own plans or agendas, so that you have a place to rest and recover and purchase some things. So faction play is a very important part of the mega dungeon. And because mega dungeons, well, they're usually quite famous or infamous and so huge, it is quite common to encounter groups of other adventurers there. This doesn't always happen in normal sized dungeons, because sometimes those places are not very well known, or because they are smaller. Usually groups of adventurers just go in, take what they can, and they get out of that place. So the chances of encountering other adventurers are reduced in those situations. But in mega dungeons, it is very common to find groups of adventurers. They could be friendly, they could be your enemies. So that's also an important thing to consider. I also think that mega dungeons are some of the most deadly places in the history of tabletop role-playing games. In fact, some mega dungeons are pretty much built to challenge the most skilled and powerful player characters. So a mega dungeon requires greater research and precaution on the part of the group of adventurers. That's where prodding or poking every place with your 10-foot pole becomes quite common, using all sorts of spells to scry, scout ahead. The rogues and rangers and monks and even barbarians, it depends. They also act as scouts to see where the areas are the safer areas to proceed, or where you can find greater rewards for less risk. It all depends on the quests and missions that you are carrying out. I also think that it's a great idea, if you don't want to cut contact completely between the mega dungeon and the campaign setting, it's always great to keep some sort of interaction with the non-player characters outside of the mega dungeon. Maybe during the mega dungeon expedition you encounter some sort of map that tells you about some treasure in a town outside of the mega dungeon. You could go out and have some adventures there, and you could go back into the mega dungeon. It's also always great when mega dungeons include some alternate routes or optional entrances and exits. That way you can exit the mega dungeon for a bit. Things could get a bit less tedious. Sometimes a mega dungeon, depending on something that I'm going to talk about concerning zones, they could become a bit repetitive or tedious if it's always the same place. But by going out into the campaign world, the players get a bit of a breather. They break the monotony, the repetitiveness. And that's why I think it's very important to have different zones within the mega dungeon. And it makes sense. if there are different factions and creatures living in a mega dungeon, all sorts of beings usually try to reshape, or you could say redecorate, the areas in which they are moving through. So you have perhaps this section of the mega dungeon that is being controlled by orcs. It's going to look quite tribal, with skulls and sticks and bones everywhere, and these kind of like tarps and tents. Perhaps it all depends on how you are handling orcs in your setting. But when it comes to dark elves, maybe they are a bit more sophisticated. You have these hallways that are decorated with strange glyphs, perhaps spider-themed furniture. Maybe there are a lot of cobwebs, and you can expect encounters with giant spiders if you are handling drow as the typical spider-worshipping creatures that, as they are portrayed in Dungeons and Dragons. And so the factions and the creatures do tend to reshape, or like I said, redecorate the interior of the mega dungeon, and it is divided by sections reflecting that. Even if they are not thinking species and races, or more sophisticated, to put it in that way, you could also have beasts and aberrations that are just perhaps because a certain monster is constantly spewing like corrosive liquid around it. When you enter a certain section of the mega dungeon, the walls and the ceiling, they seem like they have been burned or marked because of some sort of substance, and then you can tell more or less that there is a creature that is sliming all over the place and causing this corrosive damage to the dungeon environment. Or maybe it's a creature that uses a lot of ice-based abilities and spells, and it turned a section of the mega dungeon into a winter wonderland. And there are no limits to how you can handle this concept of areas and zones and sections. Like I said, sometimes a mega dungeon is connected to another dimensions. So when you go through a portal or a door or anything in the mega dungeon, you end up in an entirely different dimension that is connected to the mega dungeon, perhaps in several ways. So even though it's a separate dimension, a pocket dimension, or an entirely different campaign world, it still feels like it's a part of the mega dungeon, and you can go into it and back into the mega dungeon as you are moving through it. Mega dungeons are truly challenging, but like I said, by using the tips that I talk about in my videos, where I talk about campaign settings, complex campaign settings, and how to connect the adventure module to the game world and such, you can use those tips to create those connections with the game, with the campaign setting and the mega dungeon, but also try to identify what the player characters are going to be doing as they enter the mega dungeon. Try to think of the direction from which the party is approaching. Maybe the mega dungeon has several entrances. For example, in the case, well, I was going to say the name of a mega dungeon, but I want to avoid spoilers. So there's a mega dungeon that has several entrances. So you need to think about if they are going to be approaching from the south or the east or the north, and familiarize yourself with those first rooms or first sections within the mega dungeon, and find some way, like I mentioned in my campaign videos, to perhaps steer things or move things towards certain zones in which you are more knowledgeable, where you know about the traps, the puzzles, and the factions. But if you have to learn something good about the mega dungeon, definitely learn about each of the factions that the player characters could potentially encounter during their initial expeditions or forays. You can always use those factions as devices to perhaps hand out some side quests for the player characters to fulfill or solve, carry out some negotiations, or attack them if that is how the faction is going to work. So as you can see, there are many similarities between mega dungeons and mini campaign settings or proper campaign settings. And I definitely recommend that you try running a mega dungeon. If you have never tried it, just do it. Even if you do not complete it, it's going to be an awesome experience. I do hope you find the right group to complete it, or that you, like I said, handle that system of rotation when sometimes some players drop out and you get some new players. In my case, I have so many, well, yeah, several mega dungeons that I have to complete. I don't think I will ever. Maybe sometime in the future. It all depends. I will find a group that is more on the long-term style. That they maybe those will complete that mega dungeon. But when I finish my solo campaign of From the Ashes, maybe I will have some time to run a group with an emulated player character group. If you do not know what I am talking about, please check out my playlist where I talk about Abraham's method. But yeah, it will be a really cool idea to just have this AI controlled group, or perhaps a single player character in the tradition of Conan, Solomon Kane, etc. Perhaps just giving a few advantages to that player using perhaps solo streams, one of those systems that make the single player character a bit more powerful. I would definitely like to complete one of those mega dungeons so that I don't have to live with that sense of lack of accomplishment that I just managed to run my group through a few of the rooms, or like 40%, like I said, of the mega dungeon. I think that's the most viable way in my case to complete a mega dungeon. Like I said, unless maybe later on there will be some players or group that will want to finish the mega dungeon. Who knows? It's really a serious commitment. Imagine like 2 years taking on this huge maze filled with perils and dangers and treasure. It's quite exciting, but difficult, and like I said, you need to make several adjustments to your everyday life to carry out that titanic task. Well, thanks for watching this video, and if you have any comments or questions about Mega Dungeons, maybe some of you have finished Mega Dungeons. I would love to hear about your experiences. Maybe some of you need more information about Mega Dungeons. If something about this video wasn't too clear enough, please ask away and I will try to clear that up in future videos. But yeah, I would love to hear about your thoughts concerning Mega Dungeons, if you have ever tried them, if you plan to do it in the future, or if you dislike them or avoid them. Why do you like them? Why do you dislike them? And thank you so much to those of you that have been supporting the channel by sending the Right for RPG gift certificates. If anyone else wants to further support the channel, the information on how to do that will be in the description below. And remember, there is that offer in Bundle of Holding, offering several things with the world's largest dungeon. If you have never played a Mega Dungeon, that's one of the more affordable ways to get one. Once again, thank you, and see you later.